What's up, fam? Today we're talking about boundaries. Fun, 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 fun. What's up, y'all? It's Rachel Elizabeth, and you're watching Real Talk with Rach, where we talk about the things that really matter, that get us further ahead in life, in relationship, and closer to God. And today we're talking about something that may or may not be a fun subject to talk about, but that's why it's Real Talk. We're talking about stuff that maybe you don't want to talk about, but it's necessary and it's helpful, and hopefully it'll be encouraging to you too. As many of you know, I am currently in the middle of this crazy faith journey I've lovingly called Purposefully Homeless. When I first left Los Angeles on October 1st, I had no idea where I was going, and the whole first week was literally a day-to-day trusting God and fully surrendering to whatever He had for me that day, whoever He wanted me to serve or pray for or minister to or just be with, also called the ministry of presence. That's a thing. It's a real thing and it's awesome. But every single day was different. I had no idea what to expect, and it was very exciting. That said, side note, every day had a struggle of its own, and I had to learn how to trust God in a new way every single day. Now, a week into that, I got to surprise my mom for her 60th birthday. My parents live in Washington. My sister and the two current grandbabies, there's another one on the way with my brother's family, but the two current grandbabies live in Fort Collins, Colorado. So my dad surprised my mom with a trip to see the grandbabies, and I surprised my mom being on this crazy journey by telling her that I was headed to Dallas when really I was headed to Fort Collins to surprise her too. So now that I'm in Fort Collins, I've been here for a week and I'm living with my sister and her family, and it's been absolutely amazing, but not without difficulty. And I don't mean that towards her or my sister's family at all. I mean personally, spiritually. And this is where talk gets real. Y'all, it has been so amazing, but it has been so hard. And I mean that with all sincerity. I kinda want every one of you to experience what I've been experiencing, and at the same time I wouldn't wish it on any of you because it's been that kind of a struggle. I am a doer. I am the type of person that typically has a goal, a vision of that goal, and works tirelessly to break that goal down into baby steps. As many of you know me as having started Cause Fitness and following my fitness journey and competing in bodybuilding competitions and basically setting out and getting everything that I set my mind to, or achieving everything I set my mind to, basically accomplishing my goals. And I'm in this place God has brought me to where I am forced to wait on Him, to trust Him with everything, and to surrender to Him as my constant, Him as my guide, Him as my everything, and be completely dependent on Him. Now, some of you might not think that I have to depend on God as much being in one place for a little bit longer, and that's not entirely true because I still have this sense of my journey not being over. So this is where my struggle lies. I am in this wonderful place with a bed and a roof over my head, and I get to spend quality time with my nephews, which I absolutely adore, and quality time with my sister and my brother-in-law, who I absolutely adore, and yet I have this sense of unsettledness. And just to give you guys a peek into what that looks like, right behind me is one of my suitcases. It is not yet unpacked. And the reason for that is this sense of unsettledness. In my heart and in my spirit, I know that I'm leaving here soon. The problem comes in not knowing when that is, or to where that is, or why that is. All of those things are a struggle for me because, I think this is pretty much across the board in human nature. We want to control things when we don't know what's going on. We want to hold on to what we know as long as we can. Basically, we don't want to trust God with the next step. That is my struggle. It is so insanely difficult. I don't know how to express my frustration with this. And yet, God is faithful. And I think that is honestly the entire point. But before I talk more on that, I want to talk about boundaries. Let me explain. We as human beings, by nature, seek constants. We seek stability. We seek structure and order. And that, I believe, truly is because we were made in the image of God. And those are all characteristics of God. Creative order, structure, stability, the opposite of chaos. God is not a God of confusion. He gave us sound mind. All of those things are part of God's character. And if we were made in the image of God, those are going to be things that we naturally crave or lean towards or desire, even if we can't obtain them. And side note, I think many times in our nature, when we crave those things but we can't quite grasp them, it's because we haven't allowed God to do that in us and through us and for us. We're still trying to do things our own way. But that said, it is natural to seek out things of God even if we don't know that that is who we're seeking. And that is why we're seeking those things. Because if we're made in the image of God, we're going to want, underneath everything else, structure and love and consistency and faithfulness and honor and just all these good things. But in a fallen world, in a broken world, and I think it's pretty obvious if you look around, especially in today's world with everything going on, that we live in a broken world. In a broken world, we have broken natures, which mean even though we were made in God's image, everything has been distorted by sin, which is anything, thoughts, actions that separate us from God. God is perfect. God is all those good things. And yet everything is flawed and broken right now because we're living in a broken world, because we have sinned and separated ourselves from God. What I'm trying to talk about is the fact that chaos is not God's design. Inconsistency is not God's design. It's not his will. Now, because we're in a broken world, we're going to see that everywhere. And yet, when we look to God's way, when we trust him, we actually see structure and order and boundaries, which are all healthy and good and actually create freedom. Now, I'm going to talk about boundaries in a relationship setting for a second because I think that they definitely relate. When you're in a dating relationship and you have no boundaries, there tends to be a lot of hurt, a lot of unmet expectation, a lot of lines crossed, personal boundaries taken advantage of because those boundaries weren't spoken. When we don't have any boundaries in personal relationships, we're basically asking to be hurt at some point in time. And that goes for friendships, and that goes for romantic relationships, it goes for committed relationships like marriages, it goes for literally every relationship. When there are not healthy boundaries established or expectations set in advance, or even set, then it's so easy to cross those boundaries without even knowing you're doing it, and somebody's gonna get hurt. Now, that's not to say when there are boundaries that nobody gets hurt, because again, we're not perfect. We're humans. Only God can love perfectly. But boundaries actually create freedom. Think about that for a second. I'm going to say it again. Boundaries create freedom. I used to think that freedom was simply having no rules, no boundaries, and unlimited everything. Like access to whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted it. And guess what? That only creates chaos because there's no expectation or boundary set. Now there's fear. Now there is unknown. Now there is, how do I say this? I used to think freedom meant having no boundaries, when in fact, freedom, as God showed me, is understanding and submitting to God's boundaries. If you don't know what those are, then I highly encourage you to get into the Word and learn what it means to love God by obedience. Another tough subject that I'm not actually going to get into right now, but I will say that there is a lot of talk in non-religious and religious circles, and I think this has been since forever, but people will say that obeying the law of God automatically puts you into this category of what's called legalist, when really the law was created by God as a boundary to protect us and create freedom. And if you look at what the greatest commandment is loving God and loving people, which is what I talked about in last week's video, all the rest of the law falls under that. So once you're actually loving God and loving other people, which is only possible by truly loving God and letting Him love other people through you, everything else just happens naturally. I don't mean that doesn't require any effort or intentionality, because it does. Because by nature, we're going to fall back into our chaotic tendencies. But when we choose to follow God's way, when we choose to follow Jesus' example, when we choose to get into the Word and get to know God and ask Him to help us in our weakness and work through our inadequacies, He more than shows up every time. And that system created by God was how things were supposed to be, which in essence creates more freedom because now we know the boundary and we're able to do whatever we want inside of that boundary or inside of that proverbial fence. I was actually talking to my sister about this subject of constants and boundaries and freedom this morning, and she brought up this study that she found and read, and she was actually reading it in the context of parenting, but it is perfect. It's absolutely perfect for what we're talking about today, because the study was observing children on a playground. One of the playgrounds had a fence around the perimeter of the playground, and one of them did not. In the situation with the fence around the perimeter of the playground, the children left the playthings in the middle and actually moved around the area to the fenced perimeter, meaning they went further out when there was a fence. But when there was no fence, the children stayed in the middle on the playthings in one place. Basically, that's showing that there is a fear of chaotic and a drive for familiar when there are no boundaries. So it can either push us in two ways. It can either push us to tendencies of control and fear and insecurity, or it can push us to submitting and trusting God. But I truly think that it's impossible to trust God if you don't know His consistency. The fact that He is a constant actually makes it possible to trust Him, because until you know who God is, and I've said this a million other times and I'll say it a million more times, until you know the character of God, that He is and always will be faithful, good, constant, loyal, just, merciful, all-loving, peaceful, all these amazing things. Once you know that that is who God is, you can rest and actually trust Him, and you have this sense of freedom that you'll never experience anywhere else. And I promise you that, because I used to live in so much fear. That's not to say that fear doesn't pop into my life now and again, because it does. It has on this trip. But it's only when I forget to remember God's goodness, when I forget to remember God's faithfulness, when I forget how faithful He's been. So I'm going to leave that there today. Even though I don't know the answers to my questions, I have been encouraged over the last 24 hours. I met up with one of my best friends in Boulder, and we had a girls' night in an Airbnb, and we just prayed for each other and hung out and watched a movie and just caught up and expressed our fears and worries. And at the very end of this trip, when I was about to leave, I apologized for being a hot mess, and what she did made all the difference in the world. She reassured me that just because I was going through hard stuff didn't mean she was going to leave. So she showed me consistency in that. And that, my friends, is what it's all about. That's God's character. He doesn't leave when we mess up. He gives us all the chances in the world as long as we keep coming back to Him. He's never going to leave us. He's never going to forget about us. And He has great plans for each and every one of us. But we have to go to Him for His boundaries and trust that they're for good purpose and for freedom. The Bible says it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. And it's only through Jesus that we can find that freedom. I love you all. I hope you really enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos like this. They're out every Wednesday at 10 a.m. If you'd like to be more of a support for this series and everything else I'm doing in my ministry, please consider joining my Patreon family. You can find all the information you need in the link in the description box below. And I will see you next week. If you watched all the way to the end of this video, tell me where in the United States I should go next and why.